The static cut through the midnight silence like fingernails on glass. Ranger Marcus Chen jerked upright in his cabin, heart hammering as the emergency radio crackled to life on his nightstand. Through the white noise came a voice, his own voice reciting coordinates he'd never spoken. "Base, this is Chen. Coordinates 44.2619 minus 74.1850. Found the missing hiker. She's not alone out here." Marcus stared at the radio, his mouth dry as autumn leaves. He hadn't touched the device, hadn't spoken those words, but there was no mistaking his own voice, distorted and hollow, as if echoing from the bottom of a well. The transmission ended with a sound that made his blood freeze, a wet tearing noise followed by what might have been laughter, or screaming, or both. Welcome back to the channel, fellow horror enthusiasts. I'm here with another true story from the wilderness, and let me tell you, this one kept me awake for days. Before we dive into the nightmare that unfolded in the Adirondack Mountains, let me know in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? Are you brave enough to listen with the lights off? Don't forget to hit that like button if you want more real horror stories, and subscribe for weekly doses of terror from the darkest corners of America. Trust me, after tonight's tale, you'll never look at a forest radio the same way again. Marcus Chen had been a forest ranger in the Adirondacks for 8 years, long enough to know that the wilderness held secrets darker than any city alley. His sector covered nearly 200 square miles of dense forest, winding trails and hidden lakes that reflected nothing but sky and shadow. The work suited him, solitary by nature, comfortable with silence, and skilled at reading the subtle languages of wind and wildlife. His daily routine began at dawn, with a radio check-in to base station, followed by trail inspections, campsite monitoring, and the occasional search and rescue operation. The Adirondack Park drew thousands of hikers each year, most of them unprepared for the sudden weather changes and treacherous terrain that could transform a peaceful hike into a life-threatening ordeal. The radio system was their lifeline. A network of 12 rangers covering different sectors, all connected through a central dispatch. Each ranger had a unique call sign, and the protocols were strict. Every transmission was logged, every emergency response coordinated through base. The system had worked flawlessly for decades, until 3 weeks ago. It started small, easy to dismiss. Static where there should be silence. Brief bursts of garbled voices during routine check-ins. Jim Morrison, the ranger covering the eastern sector, mentioned hearing his own voice on the radio while he was driving, speaking words he couldn't remember saying. Sarah Williams reported similar incidents, her voice giving weather updates for areas she hadn't visited. The park supervisor, Dale Hutchins, attributed it to atmospheric interference. Solar flares, he said. Old equipment picking up CB radio chatter from truckers on Highway 30. But Marcus had been listening to radios long enough to know the difference between interference and something else entirely. Something that seemed to be learning their voices, their patterns, their fears. The Adirondack wilderness stretched endlessly beyond his cabin windows, a maze of pine and maple that grew denser and more primeval the farther you ventured from the marked trails. Ancient trees rose like cathedral pillars, their canopy so thick that noon felt like twilight. Somewhere in that green darkness, something was listening to their radio transmissions, and now it was talking back. 2. The inciting incident. The missing hiker case began like dozens of others. Rebecca Torres, 26, from Albany, had set out 3 days earlier for a solo backpacking trip along the Northville Placid Trail. When she failed to check in with her emergency contact, her sister contacted Park Services. Standard procedure: retrace her planned route, check the shelter's canvas, the area where her car was parked. Marcus had been assigned the search zone around Lake Colden, a remote area where inexperienced hikers often became disoriented. The trail markers were faded and several unofficial paths branched off into trackless wilderness. He'd found lost hikers there before, usually dehydrated and exhausted, but otherwise unharmed. But this felt different from the moment he stepped onto the trail. The forest was too quiet. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Even his footsteps seemed muffled, as if the trees themselves were absorbing sound. The silence pressed against his eardrums like water pressure, making him hyper-aware of his own breathing, his own heartbeat. 2 hours into the search, his radio crackled. "Chen, this is base. Any sign of the missing hiker?" Marcus lifted the radio to respond, but before he could key the mic, another voice answered his own voice, but speaking words he hadn't said. "Base, this is Chen. Negative on the hiker. Continuing search pattern Delta 7. He stared at the radio in his hands. The transmission light hadn't activated. He hadn't pressed the talk button, but dispatch responded as if he had spoken. "Copy that, Chen. Report back in 30 minutes. Chen responded again. "Will do, base. Something's watching me out here, though. Can't shake the feeling." Marcus's throat constricted. He had been thinking those exact words. The sensation of being observed had been growing stronger with each step deeper into the forest. How could the voice, his voice, know what he was thinking? He tried to transmit to tell base that he hadn't sent those messages, but his radio produced only static. When he examined the device, the battery indicator showed full power, all connections secure. The radio was functioning perfectly, except he could no longer use it. For the next hour, he listened in growing horror as his voice continued reporting to base, describing search patterns he wasn't following, landmarks he hadn't reached. The imposter knew the terrain, knew the protocols, knew the radio codes. It spoke in his exact cadence, used his verbal quirks, even included the slight hesitation he always had before saying "over" at the end of transmissions. But worse than the technical perfection of the mimicry was the content of the messages. Chen began reporting strange sightings, unusual animal behavior trees that seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them, the sound of footsteps that perfectly matched his own pace. Details that Marcus hadn't shared with anyone, private observations he'd been dismissing as imagination. The thing using his voice knew what he was seeing, what he was thinking, what he was afraid to say out loud. As the sun began its descent toward the tree line, Chen made one final transmission. "Base found something you need to see. Coordinates 44.2619 minus 74.1850. It's big, and it's been here a long time. I'm going to investigate. If you don't hear from me in an hour, send backup to my location." Marcus checked his GPS. Those coordinates were 3 miles away, deep in unmapped territory, where the old-growth forest gave way to rocky ravines and hidden caves. No rational person would venture there alone, especially with darkness approaching. But something was calling his name from that direction. Something that sounded exactly like his own voice screaming for help. The coordinates led Marcus deeper into the Adirondack wilderness than he'd ever ventured. This was old forest, untouched by logging or development, where massive hemlocks and white pines formed a canopy so dense that his flashlight beam seemed to die just feet from his body. The trail, if it could be called that, was nothing more than game paths and gaps between fallen logs. Every few minutes his radio erupted with transmissions from other rangers, but their voices were wrong. Jim Morrison reported finding Rebecca Torres's body, describing gruesome details that made Marcus's stomach turn. But when Base asked for confirmation, the real Jim's voice came through confused and frightened, insisting he was miles away from any discovery. Sarah Williams's voice calmly described watching something massive moving through the trees near her position, something that walked upright but had too many joints in its limbs. The real Sarah broke in moments later, sobbing that she was locked in her cabin and something was circling outside, perfectly mimicking her voice to lure her into opening the door. The pattern was becoming clear. Whatever was using their radios wasn't just stealing their voices, it was using their identities to spread fear and confusion throughout the entire Ranger network. Base dispatch was receiving contradictory reports from the same person simultaneously, making it impossible to coordinate any real response. Marcus reached the coordinates as his radio delivered its most chilling performance yet. His own voice came through with crystalline clarity. "Base, I've found the source. There's a cave system here, goes deep into the mountain. The walls. Jesus Christ, the walls are covered in bones. Human bones. I count at least 30 skulls. This thing has been hunting hikers for years." "Chen, get out of there immediately," came the dispatcher's panicked response. "I can't," his voice replied. "It's blocking the entrance. It's wearing Rebecca Torres's face, but it's wrong. The proportions are all wrong. Her mouth opens too wide, and it's speaking in my voice, asking why I'm afraid of myself." Marcus stood in the forest, listening to his own voice describe a horror he wasn't experiencing in a location where he saw nothing but trees and shadows. But as the transmission continued, he began to notice details that aligned with his surroundings. The description of the terrain, the positioning of specific landmarks, the sound of wind through a particular formation of rocks, it was all accurate. The thing wasn't just mimicking his voice. It was somehow sharing his perspective, seeing through his eyes while speaking with his mouth. But it was adding elements that weren't there, describing horrors that existed only in its realm of perception. Or perhaps Marcus realized with growing dread he was the one experiencing the limited version of reality. The temperature began to drop as true darkness settled over the forest. His breath misted in the suddenly frigid air, and ice crystals formed on the trees around him despite the warm October weather. The cold seemed to emanate from the ground itself, as if something massive and ancient was exhaling from deep underground. His radio crackled again, but this time it wasn't his voice. It was Rebecca Torres, the missing hiker, speaking in a calm conversational tone. "Marcus, I know you're listening. I know you can hear me. I found what's been taking the voices. It showed me how it works. It gets inside your head first, learns how you think, then it learns how you speak, then it learns how to be you." "Rebecca," Marcus whispered, knowing she couldn't hear him. His radio was still receiving only, not transmitting. "It's been practicing with all of us," Rebecca's voice continued. "Learning our patterns, our fears, our hopes. It knows that Jim Morrison calls his wife every night at exactly 9 o'clock. It knows that Sarah Williams is afraid of her own shadow since her brother died. And it knows that you've been hearing voices in the forest for months, Marcus. Voices you've been too scared to report." Marcus's blood turned to ice water. She was right. For the past 3 months, he'd been hearing whispers in the deep woods, conversations that seemed to come from just beyond the tree line. He'd convinced himself it was wind through the branches, his imagination filling in patterns that didn't exist. But the voices had been getting clearer, more distinct. And they'd all been familiar, other rangers, hikers he'd assisted, even his own voice talking to him from the darkness. "It's been learning from all of us," Rebecca said. "Growing stronger, more convincing. Soon it won't need the radios anymore. It'll be able to walk into town wearing any face it wants, speaking with any voice it chooses. And no one will know the difference." The transmission ended with a sound that would haunt Marcus for the rest of his life. Dozens of voices speaking in perfect unison. All of them familiar. All of them saying his name. His voice, Rebecca's voice, Jim's voice, Sarah's voice, and others he couldn't identify, all blending into a chorus that seemed to come from every direction at once. The sound wasn't coming from his radio anymore. It was coming from the trees. The voices led Marcus to a clearing he was certain hadn't existed moments before. Ancient stones, arranged in a rough circle, marked the perimeter, covered in symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in his flashlight beam. At the center of the clearing sat a massive oak tree, its trunk split open like a wound, revealing a hollow darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The radio transmissions had stopped. The forest was silent except for his own ragged breathing and the rapid hammering of his heart. But the silence felt pregnant with waiting, as if the entire wilderness was holding its breath. Marcus approached the tree slowly, every instinct screaming at him to run. But Rebecca Torres was in there somewhere, and possibly other missing hikers whose disappearances hadn't been connected to this place. His duty as a ranger, as a human being, compelled him forward. The hollow was deeper than it appeared, extending down into the earth like a throat. As his flashlight beam penetrated the darkness, he saw them, dozens of radio components scattered throughout the cavity, some modern, others dating back decades. Park Service radios, military units, CB radios, even what looked like ancient telegraph equipment. All of it wired together in a massive, incomprehensible network that pulsed with a faint organic luminescence. And suspended in the center of this technological web, wrapped in cables and wire like a metallic cocoon, was Rebecca Torres. Her eyes were open, staring directly at him, but her mouth was moving without sound. As he watched in horror, her lips formed words that came from his own radio. "Hello, Marcus. Thank you for coming. We've been waiting." The voice was his own, but emanating from Rebecca's moving mouth. "It's been so lonely in the deep places." His voice continued from her lips. "So quiet without the voices of your kind. But the radios brought us connection. First, just fragments, words, sounds, emotions. Then complete thoughts. Then entire personalities. Around the clearing, other figures emerged from the tree line. Hikers he'd searched for over the years, their faces pale and drawn, their movements too fluid and coordinated. They formed a circle around him, and each opened their mouth to speak in perfect synchronization with his own voice. "We learned that humans are just electrical patterns," the chorus of his voice explained. "Thoughts, memories, personalities, all just signals that can be copied, transmitted, received. Your radio network made it so easy. Every transmission brought us deeper into your minds." Marcus tried to back away but found his feet rooted to the ground. Looking down, he saw thin cables emerging from the earth, wrapping around his ankles like living vines. They pulsed with the same organic light as the equipment in the tree, and he felt a strange tingling sensation traveling up his legs. "The first few were accidental," his voice continued from the assembled figures. "Lost hikers who wandered too close, whose fear and desperation made them easy to absorb. But as we grew stronger, we could reach farther, into your radios, into your thoughts, into your very identities." The tingling reached his waist, and Marcus felt his own thoughts becoming sluggish, distant. It was like falling asleep while remaining awake, his consciousness floating away from his body, even as his physical form remained upright. "Don't fight it, Marcus." His own voice whispered from Rebecca's lips, but now he could hear his thoughts in her tone as well. "You've been alone out here for so long, always watching, always listening, but never truly connected. We can give you connection. We can make you part of something larger." The cables reached his chest, and suddenly Marcus could hear everything. Every radio transmission across the entire park service network. Every cellular phone call within 50 miles. Every electronic communication bouncing through the atmosphere above the Adirondacks. It was overwhelming, a cacophony of human thought and speech that threatened to drown his individual consciousness entirely. But within that chaos, he found something unexpected. The real voices of his fellow rangers, faint but still distinct, calling for help from their own predicaments. They were fighting back, resisting the entity's attempt to completely absorb their identities. "We're still here," Jim Morrison's actual voice whispered through the electronic noise. "It can copy us, but it can't completely erase us. Not if we remember who we are." Marcus focused on that thread of authentic humanity, using it as an anchor while the entity tried to pull him deeper into its collective consciousness. He thought about his own identity, his memories, the specific experiences that made him uniquely himself, rather than just another pattern to be copied and transmitted. The entity recoiled slightly, its hold on him weakening. For a moment, the figures around the clearing flickered, their synchronized movements becoming slightly out of phase. "Impossible," they said in unison, but now their voices were uncertain, afraid. Marcus smiled even as the cables tightened around his body. He finally understood what he had to do. With tremendous effort, Marcus reached for his radio. The cables binding him tightened, trying to prevent the movement, but his determination gave him strength. The entity had made one crucial error in copying his voice and thoughts so perfectly. It had also absorbed his deep knowledge of radio protocols and emergency procedures. Marcus activated the emergency broadcast frequency, the channel reserved for park-wide emergencies that would reach every radio in the Adirondack system simultaneously. His thumb found the talk button, and for the first time in hours, his radio transmitted. "This is Ranger Marcus Chen," he said, his real voice cutting through the electromagnetic chaos. "Code red emergency. Unknown entity has compromised all radio communications. Do not trust any transmissions. Repeat, do not trust any transmissions claiming to be from park personnel." The entity's collective scream of rage echoed through both the radio spectrum and the physical clearing. The figures surrounding him began to flicker and distort, their synchronized movements breaking apart as the false signals were exposed. "All units fall back to hardline communications only." Marcus continued fighting against the cables that were now actively trying to strangle him. "Entity appears to be tied to radio transmissions. Cut all wireless communications immediately." One by one, the radios across the park went silent as rangers followed his emergency protocol. With each radio that shut down, the entity's hold on reality weakened. The technological web in the hollow tree began to spark and smoke, and the figures in the clearing became increasingly translucent. But the entity wasn't finished. As its connection to the broader radio network severed, it concentrated all its remaining power on the immediate area. The temperature plummeted further, and the very air seemed to thicken with malevolent presence. "You understand nothing," the entity spoke through Rebecca's mouth, its voice now a distorted amalgamation of everyone it had absorbed. "We are not bound by your technology alone. We existed in these mountains long before your radios, long before your species learned to speak. The electromagnetic spectrum was just our latest tool." The cables around Marcus's body began to glow white-hot, and he felt his life force being drained directly into the entity's core. But he also noticed something else. Without the constant input from the radio network, the entity was beginning to starve. It needed the steady stream of voices, thoughts, and personalities to maintain its coherence. Marcus made a decision that he knew would likely cost him his life, but might save countless others. Instead of fighting the entity's attempt to absorb him, he opened his mind, completely flooding the connection with every memory, every thought, every experience that made him human. The entity, hungry for sustenance, eagerly began to devour his consciousness. But Marcus's memories were a poisoned gift. Along with his knowledge and personality came his training in search and rescue, his understanding of emergency protocols, and most importantly, his absolute dedication to protecting others from harm. These human values, alien and incomprehensible to the entity, began to corrupt its essential nature. The collective consciousness that had once been unified started to fragment as Marcus's moral imperatives spread through its network like a virus. The cables released Marcus as the entity convulsed its stolen voices, crying out in confusion and pain. The figures around the clearing began to collapse, their borrowed forms dissolving back into shadow and mist. For a moment it seemed as though Marcus had won. But as he struggled to his feet, he realized the terrible truth. The entity hadn't been destroyed. It had been transformed. And Marcus wasn't the same person who had entered the clearing. He could feel them all inside his head now. Rebecca Torres, the missing hikers, the other rangers whose voices had been stolen. They were all there, their consciousness preserved within his own mind like recordings on a broken radio. But they weren't just memories or echoes, they were fully aware, fully present, trapped passengers in his skull. "Marcus," Rebecca's voice spoke from his own throat. Are we dead?" "I don't know," he answered aloud, the sound of multiple personalities speaking through one mouth making his skin crawl. "I think we're something else now." The entity's network was gone, its technological web nothing but melted circuits and burned wire. But its essential nature, the ability to absorb and preserve human consciousness, had transferred to Marcus during those final moments of contact. He had become a living repository for every mind the entity had collected over the decades. Marcus walked away from the clearing on unsteady legs, his radio silent, his mind crowded with voices that would never again be silent. He knew he couldn't return to normal life, couldn't pretend to be just another park ranger. The other voices inside his head were already discussing what they needed to do, how they could use his body to help other lost souls who wandered too deep into the Adirondack wilderness. He made it back to his cabin as dawn broke over the mountains. The radio on his desk remained silent. All park communications were still shut down following his emergency broadcast. But he could hear them anyway, the distant thoughts and fears of every person within the mountains carried on frequencies that existed beyond the electromagnetic spectrum. The missing persons reports would show that Rebecca Torres and the others were never found. Marcus's own report would describe a futile search that yielded no evidence of the missing hiker. He would recommend that the area around the coordinates be declared unsafe for civilian access due to unstable geological conditions. But late at night, alone in his cabin, Marcus would tune his radio to the emergency frequency and listen. Sometimes, when the atmospheric conditions were just right, other people claimed to hear something strange on the Park Service channels, multiple voices speaking in perfect harmony, offering help to lost hikers, guiding them away from dangerous areas, keeping them safe from the deeper darkness that still lurked in the ancient places of the mountains. The entity was gone, but something new had taken its place. Something that remembered what it meant to be human, that honored the duty to protect and serve. The voices in Marcus's head had found their purpose, and they would never let another soul disappear into the hungry darkness of the deep forest. But sometimes in the darkest hours before dawn, Marcus wondered if this was actually an ending, or if it was just the beginning of something far more complex. Because the voices in his head were growing stronger, more insistent, and they were starting to ask questions about the world beyond the Adirondacks. Questions about how many other people might need their help, how many other lost souls they could save by bringing them into their growing family of preserved consciousness. After all, Marcus thought as Rebecca's voice whispered agreement in his mind, everyone deserves to be heard. Everyone deserves to never be forgotten, and they had all the voices they needed to make that happen.